Hello and welcome to another episode of Marriage on a Tightrope. This is Allan.
And I'm Katie.
And we're still married. We are joined today by Gina Colvin and Nathan McCluskey. Thank you so much. We've been so excited to have you guys on.
Oh, thanks for having us, Allan and Katie.
Yeah, likewise.
I just have to say, and I warned them before we started recording, I was going to do this. But when we first set this interview up, Nathan reached out to me on Facebook Messenger, and I was like, "Oh yeah, sure, we'll interview you. Is your wife on board? Is she okay? And who is she?" And then I go to your profile and see it's Gina Colvin, and I go, "Oh my gosh, okay, this is going to be interesting." And then I think, "All right, I'm intimidated. She's brilliant. I love what she does." And then you go and get interviewed by John DeLynn, Nathan, and I listen to that whole podcast, and I go, "Oh my gosh, we are in big trouble. He's just as brilliant as Gina. What are we going to do?"
We have a few friends that we're going to interview you, and they're like, "Oh, you got the interview coming up." And we said yes, and we just said we'll make as few remarks as possible because you both are so well-spoken and very intelligent, and so we will give much of the time over to you.
Oh, no. It's just all bluff. It's all bluff, Allan and Katie.
Very, very flattering. Thank you.
No, you guys are great. For those who are listening, with this interview, I think is very unique because both Gina and Nathan, as we just said, have very strong voices in this space, and just the religious, the Mormon, the LDS, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints space. Many of our listeners who aren't in the Facebook groups and listening to all the podcasts may not know who Gina and Nathan are. So I think this is a very unique opportunity for Gina and Nathan to tell their story to at least a portion of our audience that has no idea what you've been through. So it's a very unique opportunity for us to chat today.
So I think going right along with that, let's go ahead and have you guys at least introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are, where you live. I think that's unique.
You've got a little bit of a different accent than we do.
That's right. And then just about how you met, just a little bit about you.
Oh, wow. That's a really long story. Depending.
I know, right?
I know.
That'll take us through the whole hour pretty much.
That would. I'm gonna jump in and say that we've pretty much known each other most of our lives. We grew up in Christchurch, New Zealand, in adjacent wards, and then in a similar, and then in the same ward. Nathan, before his mission, was my first husband's executive secretary. He was a bishop, a very young bishop, I might add. So, just so as not to age me too much. I think I was still a teenager when he was called as a bishop.
No.
Oh, maybe my early 20s.
He was 22, so you were 21, I guess.
No, it's 3 years between us, so he must be 24. Anyway, beside the point. No, don't
90s.
calculate.
I remember the late 90s too.
Yeah. So we live in Christchurch, New Zealand, where we grew up. When Nathan returned home from his mission, he had a revelation that I should be the one. And I'm thinking, "Oh, dude, you're in La La Land." If I had $1 for every person who said I've had a revelation that I should marry you, I'd be rich. I just thought he was a crackpot. Still do, really.
She's not wrong.
But I took a punt, and it's been pretty good. It's got better. And just to say that we have very much differentiated in terms of our faith journeys.
Yeah.
And that's been an interesting story in itself.
Nathan, talk a little bit about kind of before you met Gina, what does your kind of background spiritually or involvement in the church look like?
So I was raised in the church. My parents, because of my father's kind of interesting relationship with the church, was kind of on again, off again. So there were periods of inactivity and activity. He was also not particularly well, so there were periods of time we didn't go to church because he wasn't well enough to go. So it was a bit mixed in that regard, but I was always, associated with the church in some way throughout my upbringing. I had what I would call my epiphany event that brought me to conversion when I was 16. It was my final year of seminary. I was challenged to read the Book of Mormon. I did that and received an answer which was overwhelming and undeniable for me. It was only one of maybe 5 visions that I've had in my life, and that set me on a path that meant that I've remained active in the church ever since. So as a result of that, I served a mission in Melbourne, Australia, and I've known Gina pretty much my whole life, but she's 4 years older than me. So kind of when I was a teenager, like in my early teens, she was in her late teens. So while I always thought she's quite attractive, she never really looked at me in that way. And then she got married, and as she said, I became the executive secretary to her husband, who was the bishop. And when I returned from my mission, while I was on my mission, her and her husband split up. He had an affair, was excommunicated, and when I returned, the new bishop who replaced him called me as his executive secretary as soon as I returned from my mission. And he said, the first thing I want you to do is organize for Gina's sealing cancellation. And because I was his executive secretary and I was pretty close to him, when I was on my mission and I heard that they had separated, I kind of thought, well, it's probably Gina's fault because he's the bishop, right? He's a great guy. It wouldn't have been him. And I remember her being quite strong and bolshy and opinionated and a bit pushy for a woman in the church. And I don't know why you're looking quizzical, Allan.
I wouldn't have characterized her that way.
And when I got back and I was given all the paperwork to work with Elder Pullman on the cancellation of sealing, I saw the full story and what had really happened, and it turned my heart towards her, and that was important in terms of me thinking about Gina differently. But really, in terms of us getting together, that my thinking about that didn't really occur until a bit later. But we're talking about short time frames. We were married within 3 months of me coming home from my mission. So
wow,
this all happened very, very quickly. So yeah, and that, one night we had an interview or she had an interview. She was having ongoing interviews with the replacement bishop, just kind of pastoral care.
I don't think it was pastoral care.
What was it?
He was a bit sleazy, actually. He always wanted to have special hugs. Anyway, that's another story. Bring it in, Gina.
Well, he wasn't so sleazy that he didn't ask for me to be at the stake centre while he was interviewing her so that they wouldn't be alone together. So I think that's to be noted. And after one of those interviews, he said, hey, let's go out for pizza. And we went out for pizza. And that was the first time, I think, really, that I started to kind of connect with Gina on a more personal level. I found it interesting. We were sitting there, we were having pizza, and Gina made a comment which kind of stuck with me. And I guess being reasonably young and naive, it shocked me a little bit. But she said, the last time I went out for pizza with the bishop, I had sex with him afterwards. So, she talks about him being a sleaze, but, I think, it was going both ways.
Wasn't that bishop? My husband bishop.
It was her husband bishop, right? She was talking about, but I thought, wow, she thinks about things a little bit more openly and differently, and I found that appealing. But our experience in terms of me realizing that she was the one kind of came about through an experience that I had where we were sitting in in a young adult gospel doctrine class, and she announced that she was going to move overseas after the Sunday school teacher asked her if she could teach for her while she was away. And Gina said, well, I can't. I've already got my tickets. I'm moving to Australia. And a voice very clearly said to me, stop her. And so much so I turned to look who was speaking to me, and there was no one there. And I realized it was the voice of God. And so I said to her, I need to talk to you about something after the class. And I told her, I just feel to tell you shouldn't go. And she said to me, why, do you like me or something? Do you want to have a fling before I go? What's this all about? and I said, I really don't know. And that afternoon I went home and I spent the afternoon kind of an Enos afternoon on my knees. And I had a vision of our life together, and that was the second vision I've ever had in my life. And as a result of that, I knew she was the one for me to marry, but I didn't know how to tell her that. We'd not dated. She was, older than me, a lot more experienced. She wasn't what I'd imagined I was going to marry. I was thinking of, like a younger, straight out of young woman's kind of
a virgin.
Yeah, about my age, or but I hadn't imagined marrying a divorcee, but that turned that on its head. And so then it was a case of, how do I convince her? She's older, she's sophisticated. She already had a university degree. I hadn't been to university at all. I was unemployed, and I really didn't have anything to offer. And so I didn't know how that would go. But the next day was her mother's birthday, and she invited me along to her birthday party. And it was that same day, wasn't it? That evening, the evening of that Sunday.
I tried to keep this short.
Sorry, I'm getting too deep.
No worries.
You can edit it out later.
Oh, it's great.
And so I went that evening, that's right, to her mum's birthday, and we just chatted and had a nice time. And the next day was Gina's birthday. Her birthday's the day after her mother's, and she invited me to her birthday party, and I couldn't go because I had another commitment. But I thought, I said to her, I'll come over later and I'll give you something. And I went to the florist that day, and I thought I'll get her some flowers. And the florist said to me, she was complaining she just lost her boyfriend and how sad she was. I said, well, you think you've got problems, but I've realized that the woman that I want to marry is moving overseas to live. And she said, well, have you told her? And I said, well, no, I barely know her really. And she said, you have to tell her. If you don't tell her, you're always going to regret it. You won't know what would have happened. I said, you really think so? Like, I don't think she's going to go for it. And she said, no, you have to take your heart out. You have to present it to her with the risk that she might throw it on the ground and jump all over it. And but she said, if you don't do it, you'll never know. And I thought to myself, she's right. I have to tell her. So I said, okay, scrap the flowers, give me a red rose. I'm going to tell her tonight. And so I went over. She was watching the Barcelona Olympics, men's diving, which she seemed quite intent on. And I switched that off and I told her. And she just laughed at me and said, she patted me on the head, said, I think you're very sweet, but you're barking up the wrong tree here, buddy. And so that was how the lead up to me telling her that I wanted to marry her, and it didn't go so well.
But then it went well, and then we got married.
Then it ended up going well, right?
And mostly from my perspective, it was I wanted to marry astrologically correctly. I had married a Scorpio. Bad move. I'm a fire sign. I'm a Leo. And it wasn't until after it all fell apart that I realized what a stupid decision that was. And I thought an Aries would be good. And I discovered he was an Aries. I thought, yeah, I'll do this.
We're both Aries as
Aries.
well.
Hey!
Nice. So when's the birthday, Nathan?
April 14th.
All right. March 23rd.
What do you got?
March 29th.
April 3rd, March 29th.
Yeah.
Nice. Wow. So you have birthday weeks.
Yeah, a full week. We're headed to California for our birthdays this year.
Yeah.
Nice.
Bringing the kids, though, so it's not
really
quite
a birthday.
that great, but
And can I say, because this is going out to people who are interested in marriages.
Yeah.
What I suggest you do is actually just get real and understand where you are astrologically. Because some of these marriages are just never going to work. Like a fire sign and a water sign, just like ditch it.
Okay,
It's
so
just not.
Get out while you can.
okay,
Wait,
you
how do
here
we-
first.
How do you go? Is there like something that you Google? I mean, I am so out of place with this. I don't even know where you go to look for it.
Sarah Goodman's love signs.
No,
is it?
Linda Goodman.
Linda Goodman,
I found
yeah.
Linda Goodman's love signs, which is a little dated now, but you can find compatibility, astrological compatibility. You should be a 5-9 vibration or a 3-11. That is, and let me just say very quickly, because this is really important marriage information.
Yeah.
Every sign has an element of fire, earth, air, or water. Fires go with fires. So Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius are good combinations. Perhaps not both together, but it works. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. And then there's the water signs, which are Pisces, Cancer, and Scorpio. And then earth signs, which are Taurus, Virgo, and another really boring one. Oh, Virgo, Taurus, and what? Capricorn. And then there are the air signs. Air are Gemini, Aquarius, and Libra. Air and fire will go well with each other, and earth and water will go well with each other. But try not to mix those other elements. Fire and water, nah.
Fire and fire, we're trying hard.
Oh, fire and fire.
Fire and fire is kind of good.
It's
but
fun.
there is Aries. It's a little challenging.
Well, it's ironic because my grandmother was a Cancer, and she actually died by a giant crab. So
what?
Bad joke.
It's a bad
It's a bad joke.
All right, okay.
I thought you were going to say she died of cancer.
Right.
I thought
That was the old astrological switcheroo there.
I see.
So you had a question, I think. Did it slip your mind?
I think, oh, okay. So I was going to ask Gina, what reservations after going through all of that with your first husband did you have in finding another partner, or were you even interested in finding another partner?
I was interested in resolving a relationship that I had through my teens. He had lived in New Zealand. His father was the mission president. And he had lived in New Zealand while he was mission president. They were from North America. And he went on his mission, and I did the Dear John thing, which I regret and regretted at that time. And after my separation from my first husband, we got in contact with each other again. And we were toying around with the idea. But he comes from a very, very conservative Mormon family. And hugely, a very prominent Mormon family. So there were questions of whether or not I would be accepted. I certainly wasn't of the stock that they had hoped for. Now I wasn't virginal. Now I wasn't, and I was a New Zealander and I'm brown. So there were a lot of hurdles to overcome. And for him, I realized that it was just became insulting to me that these were the things going through his head, but I still felt I needed to resolve that. I wasn't interested in marrying a Peter priesthood again. Nathan I saw as a Peter priesthood, and also very young and immature and callow and just a returned missionary. And I had it all out for kind of missionaries and their kind of stupidity and their shallowness and arrogance. So on so many levels, he just wasn't what I was interested in. But I'm glad I married him.
I'm glad you did too.
I think he's most glad of everyone.
It's been a slow burn.
It's taken 26 years to get there, but it's nice that finally she said it.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest. For the first many years, I was like, I'm not sure I should have married you. So he had to be an Aries to cope with that.
Right. I think
she still has those moments.
So a very serious question, Gina, and I'll preface it with a very, very short story. But a little over a year ago, I was teaching in Elders Quorum. I felt the way I do now about the church, but hadn't made that publicly known. And the entire lesson was, why do people leave the church? And without tipping my hand on what direction I wanted to take that conversation, I asked the class, just list all the reasons. And one of the reasons came to mind when Nathan, you were talking about this story. And one of the elders in the room said, I've got a buddy whose wife cheated on him, and he used that as an excuse to get angry at God, to get angry at the church for how it was handled. And he used that as an excuse. Now, I could really dig into why that's not a great example, and actually that we spent the rest of the hour talking about why some of these reasons need to be dispelled. But Gina, if you could talk a little bit about the first marriage and how it happened and how it ended and how that shaped kind of your view of patriarchy or your relationship with the church, if it did impact it, that type of thing.
That's a good question. I don't think it was a marriage that should have happened. I think that there are a lot of Mormon marriages that happen simply because it's coinciding with the impatience of youth, but also there is a huge discourse in the church about the sanctity of marriage and how that should be a goal. And for young women who are neither encouraged to go on a mission or to seek an education and carve out a career and a life plan for themselves, sans children and husbands, marriage is obviously the most socially condoned arrangement that you can make. You get lots of celebration,
right,
for wanting to be married and for being married. So I was in that space, in that very youthful space of feeling really urgently into my need to make a decision and having to wait for a missionary. And then when you're 18 and 19, waiting for 2 years is a really, really long time. And I wasn't sure I really wanted to marry this guy anyway. And so this guy, Richard, came, oh, whoops.
We'll take that out. We'll take it out.
We'll call him Dick. Dick. It's fine. He won't listen. So Richard came along, and he seemed nice enough. He was a new convert. He was a friend of a friend, and very earnest, and in his own right, quite a nice person. You liked him, didn't you? He was funny and really, really bright. I liked that he was super clever. But it was just not a marriage that ought to be. But he was a tiebreaker, right? He dealt with the existential kind of wasteland of what it means to be between young women's and being an adult woman. And so, yeah. What was the other question? And it was just a marriage that should never have happened. We were at odds with each other all the time. I explained like a chemical reaction. Just everything he said irritated me, and I think everything I said irritated him. I'm aggressive, and he's passive-aggressive. So the more I spoke up about things, the more he withdrew into himself. And so it was just doomed right from the very beginning. And then a woman came along, and she was kind of an arch-feminist, sort of femme fatale person in the community who had seduced a number of men, and he was easy pickings.
Right.
And I feel really sorry for him. I mean, I don't think that was, I think that was, and I understand why affairs happen, and I understand that often it's not just about having someone to have sex with, it's the need for intimacy and affirmation, and it becomes like a fall guy for a lot of the inadequacies, your personal and emotional inadequacies. I have a lot of, what do you call that? Kind of sympathy and empathy and compassion for people who are so emotionally confused that they use another person,
right,
to deal with their pain and their loss and their suffering. I mean, it's not nice. It's a horrible, horrible thing to happen.
Right.
But I can understand why.
Mm-hmm. So,
can have an affair. I'll be grateful for that understanding.
Yes.
So, I guess the question, right, is did that experience play into your long-term relationship or view of the church? Or was that just another milestone in life that was terrible to go through, but it really didn't lead you either direction when it comes to the church?
That's a very good question. I think what it did, it took me from a naive faith to a more complex faith. Very naive. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm squished in here. So
I realise that we're both squished in.
This is more comfortable. I'm dealing with it.
Okay, just stop making noises.
I just dealt with it.
Creak, creak, creak. Anyway.
Go ahead. This is why it should be video of a broadcast, right?
That's all right.
It really did. One of the issues that I had was that it wasn't handled the way it should be. You know, when this kind of thing happened, and we're dealing with a bishop here, so it had greater implications.
Yeah.
So I naturally went to the General Handbook of Instructions and thought, okay, so how should this be how should this be dealt with? And we're talking about the early 90s, and he should have had a he should have been released immediately, and he should have had an immediate church court. And I'm not saying what the outcome should have been. I was not listened to in that situation. So I realized, in actual fact, all of the effort and the motivation of the church was going into preserving him and his membership and his mana. And I had to eat scraps. And nobody was listening to me. I said, look, he's having an affair, and they were considering me to be an overwrought woman who was making things up in her head. I said, you need to have a church discipline for him, and they refused to. And I think this had come under Ronald Polman's advice, that everything is done to help him and preserve him intact. So for 3.5 months, he was having an affair, but he was still a bishop. So this, it was really, really tough.
Yeah.
Because this put me in an interesting position, because this was my ward community and my family community. And there he was presiding, making goo eyes at this woman. And it was very, very confusing. But I think when I look back, I think that I had looked often to the church to resolve a lot of these difficulties. The church was the place you go to figure out how to manage a difficult situation. But there was nothing, like literally nothing, for a woman whose husband was a bishop, who was having an affair with somebody who hadn't been released because his seniors and his upline felt more connected and attached to him than they did to me. What do you do with that?
Right.
Where's the handbook instruction? I literally looked through every Ensign article to find something that matched this. And I realized there was nothing. And all I had was my relationship with God. And I think that's when my relationship with God really took off and became its own thing. So
that's beautiful.
That is beautiful.
So if you could take us from the beginnings of your marriage to up to whatever point. I know it's a process and there's no one specific point, but to that point where you find yourselves today, right? You find yourselves, you both feel and believe very differently about the church itself. And I really want to make sure we save time to talk about, I think, Gina, your views on God and faith are beautiful. And I want to see how that impacts you too, Nathan. So I'm sorry, I asked like 12 questions at once, but kind of take us through those years that where, Gina, your faith kind of goes away from Orthodox belief in the Mormon Church. Kind of what are some of those things that are important to you? And if you don't want to speak about it or decide, hey, let's just talk about where I'm at now and not necessarily spend the 20 minutes to talk about the journey and events that led you there. I think that's where we focus a lot on this podcast, is there are differences, how we make it work in spite of them.
I mean, I think this is a really valuable question, and it causes me to reflect. I didn't have the language of orthodox and unorthodox. I didn't understand what was happening to me. All I knew is that I married somebody and he was shocking. We get married and there is an orthodoxy to him that I was immediately shocked by. And I'd known him all of my life, and I think this percolated while he was on his mission. And so his whole life he wanted regulated and dominated and informed by church practice. And I had not been raised that way. I didn't live all my life with my mother. I was adopted into the stake president's family. And I say unofficially adopted, but I was considered one of theirs. My adopted mother she's American, and she was a BYU graduate from Seattle. And she was she was orthodox in her own way, but nothing like Nathan. And then my foster father was a very liberal stake president. He was a feminist, and he was, what do you call that? Converted. He was converted later in life. and quickly called as a stake president. He was a historian as well, and he had a lot to do with, because in those days stake presidents would all go to April General Conference. So he's a pretty well-travelled academic anyway, and a well-written academic, but he took an interest in Mormon church history. And so a lot of our conversations, I remember them really fondly late at night talking about Mormon history. He was friends with Leonard Arrington. He would bring the latest Eugene England home. The only language I had was Liahona and Iron Rodder. So that was the only way I understood it. And how I grew up was formed in the LDS tradition, we preferred the Liahona way. So, and that was if you don't know, that was a metaphor used by Eugene England. So that was the kind of life that I was percolated into as a young person, as a youth, and into my young adult years. So when I married Nathan, like I say, it was a full-on shock. And I think that comes from his naivete. I think it comes from the way he is as a person, but also his youth. He's very much younger, and he didn't have the experiences that I had. For him, it seemed like more of a straight run.
Yeah. And so Nathan, as she's explaining kind of that, she is kind of shocked into the orthodox way that you live your faith in the church. Was there an equal and opposite reaction to the way that Gina approached her faith?
I'd seen some of Gina's ability to challenge and to do so strongly before I married her. But I guess I was willing to, because of my love for her, I was willing to kind of set that aside and think, and my thought was, I know that it's the right thing to do to marry her, so the Lord will take care of that, and we'll be able to work, whatever it is, we'll be able to work it out, which has ultimately been the case. It probably just took longer than I'd anticipated, and it hasn't gone in the direction that I anticipated either. So probably the extent of Gina's reaction to my orthodoxy was more extreme than I would have anticipated. She would get very angry, furious, and she's a very passionate woman. So that meant that we would have, she would, shout and yell and swear at me, and I would.
I would.
Yeah, and I would, and as a result of that, I'd withdraw and put up my walls.
Right.
And
to be fair, though, I don't know that we knew what we were arguing about because we didn't have the language. Mm-hmm. We just knew that there was like a huge ideological difference between us. And it wasn't that my unorthodoxy was, sorry to interrupt you, can carry on a second. Right. It wasn't that my unorthodoxy meant that I wasn't like keeping the word of wisdom. I was a temple recommend holder, fully faithful and serving in the church. I just had more flexible metaphors of the divine. I just saw church differently than he saw church. And I wasn't beholden by curriculum and policy. I always thought, well, if it's not going to work in this situation, let's just dump it and see what the intention is behind it and try and approach it from another direction. But Nathan's faith in the system was so complete that he thought that every question that came up in a curriculum material ought to be answered, and there should be a church answer for everything. And that attests to his, I suppose, the simplicity of his faith and also the simplicity of his life. I think.
Yeah. You may be overstating the case regarding the simplicity of my life. I'd built simplicity into my life to deal with dysfunction that was happening in my family, I think. That was my protection. That was my safety. That was my security. And the church, I could see that in the church. I could see a mirror of that simplicity in the church. I do these things and I follow this, my leaders and the scriptures and the handbook and how they line up. And if they don't line up, just whatever your leader's telling you, then, that everything will be fine. and for me, it was like my experience in the church was largely affirming. It was empowering. It was rewarding, and so it worked for me. And so I thought, well, it should work for everyone.
So Nathan, when you recognize that it's not working for Gina, and you have that thought of, but it should work for everybody.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about, especially now for those that don't know Gina's public face and voice, I should say, with the A Thoughtful Faith podcast, and very, very strongly opinionated, and I love the opinions myself. But talk to me a little bit about having that feeling that, no, this should work for everybody, and how you two are able to make it work when so publicly Gina is not on the same page. It's not working, and she's very vocal about that. Talk a little bit about how it does work and what is difficult about that for you, either currently or what you had to overcome over the years.
So for a long time, I tried to jam my ideal down Gina's throat, when increasingly she was moving away from accepting that. So with the harder I held her into the space, the tighter I clenched my fists, and insisting that this is the only way and this is how you will be happy and this will work for you, the more it wasn't. And
ironically, the more energy I had to figure out why it wasn't.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, so he's telling me this, well, I'm going to figure out why he's wrong about that. And I became very articulate. I suppose my strong opinions of the LDS Church come out, ironically, out of our relationship because he forced me to put words around a feeling that I had, that things weren't quite right, to find those words in those arguments.
I created the monster.
He really did.
My fault.
Yeah. We have you to thank or blame, depending on which way you're looking at.
I like the first bit. Thanks, Al. Yeah. And there were other things happened which also helped me to see that it didn't always work in the way that it should. So the experience with Gina's first marriage breaking up, and her bishop that she was married to, saying to her, "You need to divorce me," and I'm telling you, this is your bishop, was a terrible situation to be put into. Should never have happened. I painted that as an anomaly. That's an extreme anomaly that wouldn't normally happen. And look, he got his just desserts. He got excommunicated. So there we go. It's all justice is served, right? But then other things would happen that I also saw were unjust. For example, on one occasion, Gina was denied a temple recommend with no real justification at the stake presidency level. She wasn't given a temple recommend interview. That the stake presidency had just gotten together and decided that she didn't have the right attitude, so she shouldn't have a temple recommend. Yeah, I kid you not. It's an interesting story. But anyway, I could see that was unjust. That was wrong. And so I went to the stake president and I told him what I thought of that. And that same day he gave her a temple recommend. But I could see that she was making valid points, that there were issues with the way patriarchy dealt with, in particular, women in the church. And that, because it had affected my wife, that had come pretty close to home. And, of course, very recently we've had that situation with Gina being called to a disciplinary council last year. And once again, I was put in the position of choosing between the church I love and the woman I love. And once again, on this occasion, I felt that it was wrong. I sat down with the bishop a couple of weeks before the disciplinary council. I told him what I thought of it, that I didn't like him. I didn't like what he was doing, that it was wrong and it shouldn't happen. And fortunately, the outcome of that was different. Hooray for that. But that doesn't change the impact that had for Gina. So I started to see some of those things, and there were little things as well, right? just the way people treated her, seeing things differently and stuff. I wasn't completely oblivious to those things, but I was still trying to hold her in. And I guess the shift happened for me. And I mean, it's interesting that Gina paints me as completely orthodox, because some years ago, I'd said to my state president that Gina thinks I'm too orthodox. And he said, well, you may be many things, but you're certainly not orthodox. If anything, you're an enigma. So other people weren't seeing me as orthodox as Gina was, but she certainly did. So that, I mean, it's interesting, but that's her perspective. I respect that. I think what it means is throughout this process, I was changing. Over the years, I was becoming more fluid in my perception of things, more nuanced in my views, but probably in what I said and the way that I acted, and particularly in relation to Gina, because I so much wanted to hold her in our family, in the church, in the ceiling, and temple attendance, all those kinds of things, that if I manifest those things, I was more likely to manifest them with my priesthood buddies rather than with her. And so there was probably some subtle distinction between the way I acted towards her and the way I acted towards others who saw me differently, as challenging some of those things. But I wasn't willing to do that so much with Gina, because I didn't want to further undermine her faith, or so I thought that's what was happening. So, but at a point, one of those moments in which, we'd had a furious argument, the air was dripping with unmet needs, and we were at wit's end, thinking like there's no point carrying on. Our marriage is destined to end up in the rubbish dump. That Gina asked me to give her a priesthood blessing, and I thought that was very courageous of her, because given what had just taken place, my thinking was, this is now my opportunity to set her right. I can use this opportunity to channel God, tell her what she needs to do once and for all, and if she wants to rebel against God, then that'll be on her. But a pretty miraculous thing happened, because when I laid my hands on her head, the words that came weren't mine, and they certainly weren't what I imagined I was going to say. And those words affirmed that the path she was on was actually right, and that God was involved in directing the choices that she was making, and the questions she was asking, and the work that she was doing was the work of God. And that was very, very clear to me. And that was really important, and it changed my heart towards what was happening with her. And I reflected on, Gina had been listening to quite a bit of Mindy Gledhill at the time, and one of her songs that says, when you love me without strings, I take flight. And I realized, as I listened to that and reflected on that blessing, that I was trying to tie Gina down to my ideal, and I wasn't letting her explore her own spiritual path that was in connection with God. And I knew that because I'd given her that blessing and felt that so strongly. And that kind of gave me the words. I guess Mindy gave me the words to see that I needed to let her go. And in letting her go, I would be able to enjoy her journey rather than resent and resist it. And that would build a stronger connection between us. And instead of our marriage becoming a shriveled leaf, I guess, it would blossom.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, that's what's happened. So yeah, it was divine intervention that really caused me to change. And I'd been praying for a long time, help Gina to change. And I realized in that moment that what needed to change was me, not Gina. And as a result of that, I came, that was my come to Jesus moment, in recognizing that in order to save my marriage, it was me who needed to change. It wasn't Gina.
Thank you for sharing. That's touching and very personal story. So thank you for sharing that. How long ago was that blessing?
Probably
3 years ago.
3 years.
3 years
Yeah,
ago.
it would be 3 years ago. No, 2016, I think. Yeah.
You know, from your perspective, what's your recollection of what that blessing meant to you?
I wasn't surprised. Because everything he said in the blessing was actually everything that I had felt.
That's great.
So I wasn't surprised. I was pleased.
Good. No, that's great. No,
But it's a tough thing, being the person who is with this Orthodox spouse. So he has an imagination for how this Mormon marriage ought to go. And it is with all of those trappings. It's with temple recommends. It's showing up and doing endowments together and doing family history together and seeing our children off on missions and through all of the milestones. And I really felt bad for him on so many levels. I felt that I know that that's the dream, and particularly that was his dream. And
You should have felt bad. It was tough.
well, I offered to divorce him. I'm like,
There's no solution.
yeah, look, I can set you up with somebody who's going to be all on board with this stuff. You're going to love it. And you won't be miserable about the fact that I literally can't show up to this religious world in the way that you want me to. I can't do it. It's not a choice. It's not a lifestyle. It's just it. I mean, I think of it now like neurons. You have Mormon neural pathways, and enough stress on them just snaps them, and you just can't grow them back again.
right.
And so you have to find another way to be in relationship with the church. And I look at our marriage and say, I can't do what you want me to do. I can't be what you want me to be. It's just not possible. Prayer's not helping it. Scripture study's not helping it. Church attendance is making it worse.
I don't think she was fasting enough, though.
Get your face. And so I say that plaintively to those people who do have spouses who are differentiating from the church. You can't change this. There is literally nothing that you can do to change it except let it be. Let it be and trust it. Infuse it with your support, however you can give that support, even if it's a confused kind of support. Trust it, because the minute that you make it an aberration, you open up this natural occurrence of growth and differentiation. You open it up to all kinds of a kind of an aberration, so people can pour all sorts of negativity into that.
Right.
And you can start to live into this story that this is all about you. You see it so often that people begin differentiating. They feel the negative energy of those people around them. And rather than turn it into a God moment, they turn it into a worldly moment. Into, well, this is my opportunity now to get drunk and experiment with drugs and et cetera, et cetera. And that may happen, but it doesn't need to be that way.
Right. Here's a little bit of a leading rhetorical question, really. When you identify Nathan, I love the story of just allowing her and knowing that you need to cut those strings and let her fly. Isn't it incredible how you just get so much closer in your relationship when you allow that space to happen and to occur? And it seems completely counterintuitive that the more individual your spirituality is, and the more you allow for the other person's spirituality to change and be what it needs to be for them, you come closer together. I mean, how do you feel that things are? What are some of the gifts, I guess we could say, the gifts of allowing for this individualization? Is that the word to say? In spiritual journeys?
And for me, it's expanded my horizon. So I've been able, not just in our relationship, but in terms of my relationship with other people, I've been able to be a lot more accepting of people's spiritual experiences outside of the church than I would have previously. And so an interesting manifestation of this is yesterday at church, a friend of mine and I were talking, and in walked this guy we'd never met before, and so we introduced ourselves to him. It turns out his name was Truth, and he was from California, and he was on holiday in New Zealand. And we said to him, so are you a member of the church in California? He said, no, I'm not a member of the church of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but I'm currently investigating it. And so while I was here, I thought I'd visit. I've been attending in Santa Cruz. And I said, well, what are you doing here on holiday in New Zealand? He said, I've come to a series of miracle meetings which are being held at Celebration Church, which is a Pentecostal church in Christchurch. And he said, and this pastor is amazing. He's healing people and he's performing these miracles. And we said, well, that sounds really Christ-like. And he just said, oh my goodness, that's what I love about this church, is it's so accepting. It's so accepting of other beliefs. He said, you know what? He said, as much as I love this pastor, in that church, if I told him I was going to this church today, he'd tell me don't go. He'd tell me it's evil. So he said, that's what I love about this church. Everyone is so accepting and open. And it was hilarious because my mate and I had just finished talking about, we just had a seminary meeting, and we just finished talking about how 2 of our children don't want to go to seminary because they're quite outspoken. They ask a lot of questions, and they feel as though they're being kind of shut down and excluded and not really, they don't feel welcome. And then this guy comes in and we have this kind of, come to Jesus moment where we're going, yeah, thank you for bringing us back to what the church is really like, or at least how it should be like.
Right.
And it was great. We had this great discussion, and we pulled out, Mark. He sat with me in Sacrament, and I showed him Mark 9:38-40, which is the experience with the apostles who say there are these people casting out devils, but they're not one of us. And Jesus says, if they're casting out devils in my name, they can't speak evil of me. They're one of us. They're doing good things. They're us. They're not them. And he was like, that's now my favorite scripture. and yeah, it was great. It just highlighted, I guess, responding to your question, that now, years ago I would have thought to myself, oh, that can't be legit. This guy, that can't be legit. But now I'm able to accept that could very well be legit, and that's awesome if it's changing people's lives and it's bringing them closer to God. What a great thing. So I think that's been one real gift for me, is that it's opened me up a lot more in that respect.
Awesome.
Yeah. But I also think, it's a lot of the things that we argued over, a lot of the tension and a lot of the real urgency has come out of those things. Gina still wants me to be different, but there's not the same necessity for that to happen, because she can still explore and experience her relationship with God without me feeling white-knuckled about that, without me feeling like I need to somehow change her so that she doesn't, fall off the plan and I have to go to hell to rescue her.
Right. Awesome. Gina, got a question.
Yeah.
Well, we're just about to that hour point. So can I actually want to read one quick paragraph from one of your blog posts, if that's all right, and then ask a question about it?
Uh-oh.
No, it's a good one, because I think, just let me read it. It says, when we adopted Finn, is it okay if I use his name?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. When we adopted Finn, we had him sealed to us. I remember when he was brought into the room by a temple worker as we knelt at the altar. It was as if beyond the veil our ancestors were talking among themselves, moving themselves around with a chorus of farewells and welcomes to this child who through tears of joy became ours for eternity. So the question is, and you may not know where I'm going with this, but the question is, so many people in my position, in your position, the one that has so many issues and problems and wants to speak out about unhealthy practices in the church, how have you found it possible to recognize the beautiful things within the church and not feel like if you recognize those things, you're giving hope to your spouse or you're bending over for them? Is that a clear enough question?
Yeah, it is. It is. Let me just see if I can organize a response.
Sure.
I think that for me, I suppose breaking up with belief has a lot to do with it. And when I say I break up with belief, that I don't have any attachments to a way of thinking about the divine that's definitive. I have no attachments. And I think that stands in opposition somewhat to, I suppose, the culture of the LDS Church, which has, I think, for too long trafficked in certainties. I think certainties give people a sense of belonging. It puts some stable ground under the feet. But in the trajectory of the soul, there's a point in which you no longer need the certainty. You need the belonging, but you no longer need the certainty, and one's belonging shouldn't be predicated on being able to affirm certainties. I come back to that point. It's hard for me to say that what I believe in. It's not that I don't feel that my soul has other belongings, or that it is that maybe there is a ground of being. We call it God, but there is something more. All of the traditions point to that, and my sense points to that. All of the wisdom traditions say that there is something more. The minute that we incarcerate the idea of God in a body and a name and a location, then I think it ceases to be God. It just becomes a figment of our own creative imagination about God, which is not to offend people who feel that they need to have that idea of God. So in giving up belief and the very idea, unattaching from the idea of whether or not something is right or wrong or true or false or believable or unbelievable, it actually relieves your suffering. And that's a very Buddhist idea, that I think that we become very, very attached to our ideas. We become clingy with them and grasping of them. But what if we just let them go? Because either they don't serve any particular function. They really don't. They just, in having a belief, you're signing up for a group, a tribal community. But really, in terms of your spirituality, they serve a fleeting function before that you move into a degree of spiritual maturity. And that doesn't mean that we don't have, anyway, we could talk about belief all day.
Yeah.
I'm not going to. So unattaching from that surprisingly gives you the breadth and the scope to see what is sacred, what is holy, without needing to say, therefore this is true. Because we don't know. I mean, the divine to me always seems very surprising. There are moments of divinity which don't come to us because we've manufactured them. So if we kind of allow air into this space of, allow ourselves to breathe in this space of contemplation, we can see the sacred. So, yes, that was a gorgeous experience that we had with Finn. It was so beautiful. Our ceiling was so beautiful. It was astounding. It was such a gift for me, whose previous temple marriage had gone pear-shaped. So it was such a gorgeous gift. Now, do I now therefore need to say, therefore, the temple is true, and I should have a temple recommend and I should go to the temple? And Nathan's nodding his head furiously.
Yes.
Currently not for me now, but I
Right.
have to say it's only honest to say, yes, it was beautiful. We had all of these young men around here last night. I don't know how many, it was 20 people. It was about 20 people, including the bishopric. And it was an Aaronic priesthood's training meeting. And I was making pancakes because it was Candlemas, and that's what you eat on the feast of Jesus' presentation. Feeling very resentful as I'm hearing the mutterings from the lounge room going on about keys and responsibilities and meetings, and it was triggering all kinds of I just hate this church feelings. Like, seriously, patriarchy starts young, and I'm going to have to deconstruct this with my boys. But then the boys came in, and I led a candle mass, a little ceremony of lighting the candle and reading the scripture, and it was really lovely. And so we always sitting with the shadow and this light, the shadow self of ourselves and the light selves of ourselves and others. Does that make anything true or not true? Well, maybe that's not the question we should be asking.
Right. Oh, I love that thought. I love that thought. I know we need to wrap it up here, but what I've liked just to contemplate, I'd like to hear from you, Katie, because I've kind of taken over as the dialogue driver here. But where Gina, I think so often, honestly, we talk to a lot of listeners, and the grand majority of them have less than a year experience of being in a mixed faith marriage, where you have 26 years, maybe not as defined as mixed faith marriage, but 26 years of experience behind it.
Pretty much.
Right?
Pretty much.
So, Gina, what you just explained is so important for those in my position, your position, that you don't have to worry about recognizing good things and good experiences within the church. It doesn't have to drive you to a conclusion that it is true, that it is for you, but there are good things. And then on the same side, Nathan, you shared your experiences on, you recognize when there's something hurtful. You've recognized when something doesn't work for Gina or something needs to be improved. On the same exact side, whether you're Orthodox or nuanced believer, it's okay to recognize things aren't always perfect and things need to be improved. So just thank you I think that was one of the top themes of kind of chatting with you guys today.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've done a few episodes with some couples that have been married, I don't know, anywhere from 5 to 10 years or less. And we've gotten a lot of flack, I think, from people that said, well, yeah, you're interviewing people who have been in this for such a short amount of time. But what about those couples who have, who are 20 plus years into their marriage and they're making it work? So this is really helpful to hear because, like I said, you guys are a really good example, very open about your experience. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Pleasure. It's been enjoyable. Thank you.
Yeah, and final word for you. We'll do our typical sign off, but anything from Nathan and or Gina that you would like to say? This could be your plug the podcast or just final thing that you're like, oh, I was hoping to talk about this. We have a few minutes. Please go ahead.
Wow. I think probably the most important message I think that I've kind of come to for couples going through the mixed faith marriage situation is, and this is the thing I had to realize that was so important, was you have to learn to love your spouse, not what they believe. I didn't, when I married Gina, I wouldn't have married her had I not been able to marry her in the temple. And so that became the big betrayal when she threw her temple recommend at the bishop and said, I don't want to go back to the temple. That's the big betrayal, that she's throwing out those commitments and those covenants that we have, or that's the way it looks. But I realized that I had not properly separated my love for Gina from my love for what Gina believes. And I think you have to do that to get into a space where you can really enjoy being married to someone. You have to love them for them. And you can still love the church, but those things don't have to be inseparably interconnected. You've got to learn to separate those things, particularly in a mixed faith marriage situation. But I think it's probably healthy anyway for anyone in a marriage who's in the church.
Great. Thank you. Gina, parting thoughts?
I think one of the things that has been really delightful about Nathan's and my marriage is that we can laugh together.
Yeah.
And there's an absurdity. When you think about it, there's an absurdity to these faith crises and these faith differentiations. Like, seriously, we're having an argument whether or not you drink a cup of tea. It's bizarre.
Sometimes I worry, that our neighbours can hear some of our arguments and they're thinking, what is she saying? They won't hear me. They'll hear Gina. They won't hear me.
Or an absurdity of really a white shirt. We've argued about white shirts. But in the same,
I'm wearing a blue shirt today.
It's Monday. But so I think just juice your relationship with just relax a little. Not everything depends on this one moment or this one argument. Enjoy each other's, enjoy the absurdity of it. Have a sense of humor about it. Work on what matters. To be honest, what has really been the consistent for us is that we have really great sex. And it's got better since he's let go of the need for me to stay in the church. So, there is a thing there.
We can add an extra 20 minutes if we. So
I would just say have touchstones, things, whether it's your sexual relationship or it's something that you together laugh at, just to give you some relief. And you don't need to talk about it all the time. Every time you see your spouse, you don't need to say, wow, this is a good opportunity for us to process our faith crisis. Maybe make a day to say, okay, at this time, we're going to confine this conversation to this time, and we're going to make sure that we're not coming up. The objective is to be present with each other, not to convince each other. So there are all kinds of things that you can do to nurture and put some safeguards around your relationship.
But it does need to happen. The discussion, I think, does need to happen.
Absolutely does.
I know there are a bunch of couples who I've engaged with online, and they say, we can't even talk about it. It's a no-go area. One of the spouses has said, we're not going to talk about this. That's it. We just can't. And I don't know how long that's sustainable. So I think you need circuit breakers, but you also need to carve out some space where you do talk about that. And ideally you put some principles in place, like I'm going to do more listening than trying to get my point across and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a way around it. And if there's not, just make sure that you have a good ending to your marriage.
So, an amicable split.
How do you decide when it needs to end, Gina?
Oh, there's a good question.
If your fire or water is off,
just give it up.
There you go.
Done. It's a done deal. Gone.
Don't even put in the effort.
Nathan and Gina, thank you so much for joining us. I cannot promise I won't bug you for another hour at some point. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're most welcome.
Yeah, it's been really enjoyable. So that'd be great.
Yeah.
We didn't get to really hear a lot about you guys. I really enjoyed listening to the podcast that you did together. And, I could really relate to you, Kattie. I know how hard it can be. And, when you started to break down, I felt that too. We've been there, but I also, I recognize it's been really tough for Gina. It's tough on both sides.
Yeah.
This not being able to completely understand or empathize with one another's position. It's tough. So the work you're doing is really important. Thank you. You're helping couples negotiate something which is more important than our differences, and that's what we have in common, our love for each other.
That's where we'll end it. Thank you so much.
Email
Thanks, guys.
Marriage on a Tightrope at gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram.
At Marriage on a Tightrope.
And if you would like to be interviewed and try to top this interview, it's not a competition. Feel free to email us. We'd love to have you on. And once again, Nathan and Gina, thank you. Talk to you next time.
Grace and
Thanks,
peace.
Alan. Thanks, Katie. Appreciate it.